it's a great pleasure to introduce Merlin Errol, the Earl of Errol. It is, I believe, the oldest, the Scottish earldom, is it not?
It's, in fact, fourth eldest, but second senior because we did some dirty works in the 1400s and bumped ourselves up to somehow.
I knew there was something like that. I have to be careful with a name like Coke, talking about anything Scottish, being descended from the last English, excuse me, English general ever to be beaten by the Scots in battle. But that was a bit later than this one. Anyway,
could happen again.
Indeed, Merlin, amongst other things, has been a very welcome member of our governing board. We have 10 members of the Commons and 4 from the Lords who supervise our work, and Merlin has given us sterling service, particularly obviously in the area of IT. But we're running late. Enough from me. I'll hand over to Merlin. Except Derek, I see at the back. Come and sit down, Derek. Derek Wyatt, MP. You don't have to hover at the back. And we'll forgive you if you want to go out earlier. There's some seats here. Derek's from the Common. Derek Wyatt, MP for Sheffield, who's aren't you chair of the Parliamentary Internet Group?
No.
Yes.
AP Commons.
Oh, no. Anyway, yes. Anyway.
This is. Do you want me to just keep it running exactly 15 minutes late?
Yeah.
Okay. Very sorry, we seem to have got 15 minutes late as a result of the usual sort of bits and pieces and no slippage in the timetable. So I'm not going to introduce the speakers or anything like that. I hope most of you can read. You've got a thing which tells you all about them. And anyway, they need no introduction because you all probably know them all anyway, and I'll only say something silly. The only thing I might comment on when I made the comment you can all read, I hope, is thinking about this whole business about accessing government service over the internet. Of course, one huge advantage could be that people don't have to read. And if we've got a very high adult illiteracy rate, running at, I hear different figures from 7 to 15% or even higher effective functional illiteracy rates, why are we bothering to put text up there the whole time and huge amounts of it? So maybe we need to think about other ways of communicating, because actually you don't need text to get your point across, except if you're trying to do something very obscure to those who've got serious degrees at universities. Anyway, with that, I'll now sit down and leave to Jerry Fishenden, who you'll probably know extremely well from Microsoft.
Good afternoon. I'm going to move quickly since we're running late. My nominated topic to talk about in 15 minutes is reinventing government for the internet age. So my thesis, which coincidentally seems to pick up on quite well where we got to, is that we don't really have a good collective understanding of how we can use the internet properly, particularly its impact on policy making. And I think from what we heard in the previous session, it's quite clear that IT's become quite narrowly perceived as being that sort of thing you throw at operational and administration purposes, and isn't really yet understood in terms of its impact on a truly transformative strand, which is what I call technology as a policy lever. So if you think where the internet's been through, it's been through a couple of iterative phases fairly rapidly, as far as most people perceive it, through a sort of informational age when people just stuck up loads of stuff on websites and sort of took all of their publications, put them online and said, there we are, E has been done, we're on the internet. And then that sort of moved into transactional, and you saw one or two people that managed to survive the dot-com boom and bust and have very successful business models, people like Amazon and eBay, that have truly brought about new business models. So quite interestingly placed the citizen or consumer in quite a different part of the landscape to where they were before. And increasingly we're seeing the sort of personal internet where people are picking and choosing the things they like about the internet and putting together in the way they want to see them and interact with them. And there's a whole load of research out there where people are saying, actually, is this a fad or a fashion? And the answer seems to be no, this is genuinely going to change the way we think about delivering services, not just in the private sector, but the public sector as well. And I think the big challenge is this old one of, if you're far too focused on your current business, if you're being waylaid all the time by the daily firestorms that most IT people certainly live with and most people in their jobs live with, it's very hard to stand back and find the time to look ahead and think about how do you actually reinvent your organisation or your business to take advantage of the internet. So a lot of the existing strand inside the public sector is what we were hearing about a bit earlier. It's about how to try and work out to deliver more optimal systems, within existing constraints. You know, how can you take some cost out of the system? How do you make the public sector as it is today more efficient in terms of the services it delivers? If you like, it's still the top-down model. It's still the provider viewpoint looking out at the world and saying, here are my silos, education, taxation, health, whatever they may be, and the citizen sitting at the bottom trying to work out how on earth they get an integrated experience when interacting with the public sector. So what we were hearing about in the first half was really this idea of a sticking plaster at the back end, about CIOs and CTOs struggling as being seen as those people that do technology, throw technology at our problem, make it work so that it's more integrated and works better than it does today. It's not about true transformation, it's about lipstick on a pig, as it's been called. And there's only so long IT guys can go on putting lipstick on that pig without finally turning around and going, hey, look, this isn't just our problem. If you truly want to transform the public sector, we need to work together on this. We need to think about the whole change programme. And how do we then move to a model that genuinely puts the citizen at the centre? There's a lot of talk about citizen-centric systems, but not a great deal of analysis going on right across the board of how you truly move from a siloed, provider-centric model to a citizen-centric one. If you look at some of the things that are going on at the moment, however, on the internet, they're about moving the citizen to be an integral part of everything. This is a simple example about what's happening with identity, where the citizen or the consumer becomes an integral part of any identification system. So if any data or any information is going to be released from one party to another, it flows back via the consumer. So they retain control about who's looking at what information about them, when it's used and how it's used. And if you look at it in a simplistic way, typical citizen scenarios, and this is a very noddy one if you like, about an adolescent's slow descent into crime, a sort of modern version of Hogarth's Rates Progress if you like. It's, you know, how somebody starts off and their experience is this flicking between dysfunctional silos. One moment they're in the education system, and the next, because they play truant, they're suddenly dealing with another bunch of people in social services. Then they're back in education, back to social services. Suddenly they're off in the hands of the police because they played truant too often and went off and did something else. Yet this isn't a typically exceptional scenario, and there are many more that we can think of, and yet where are the citizen-centric services that really focus both on that individual's experience of the public sector and also the impact it has on the rest of us as a society? Because if we don't get it right for these people, how on earth are these systems going to work for the rest of us? And again, what we're seeing on the internet today is people that can take visually rich tools and work with them in very different ways. I think Lord Errol's point is very well made. There's a lot of talk about transliteracy happening around the web. Forget putting up publications and written documents. Let people work in intuitive ways that make sense to them. If it makes sense in a genealogy application to model your family visually and put visual information in, why can't we model things the same way when it comes to claiming benefits or some sort of tax credit that involves our family and its associations? And again, you can see quite a powerful system. There are many out there. This one was called They Rule, which is quite interesting, where people are building up visual maps of which executives work for which corporations and the links and relationships between them. And I think it's a good example of how consumer power is really driving a lot of what's happening on the internet at the moment. And that Web 2.0 philosophy, whether or not you like the term, I think is quite important for how we think about public sector services, because it's not about silos, and it's not about moving to neo-silos, and there's lots of talk about audience segmentation, where instead of having education, welfare, health, you might have a motorist or something else, and just try and slice citizens in different ways. But actually, if you look at semantic tagging that's going on the web, why not let people identify their own interests? And to a provider-centric model, a lot of those are not terribly intuitive. You know, this guy, Citizen John Smith here, is a pensioner. He also seems to be a lecturer, a student, and a parent. Well, that doesn't really fit neat provider-centric models, but it does fit the reality of human beings and the way they're quite complex and their interests are quite complex. So they may be retired but working part-time, might be a lecturer but might also be studying somewhere else. So I think the new realities of the internet state are that you don't need to own and control and manage everything yourself. And you can see that with the way people are taking sources of information from all over the internet and putting it together in ways that make sense for them. And what lessons does that have for all of us who are interested in the design of the public sector services? There are examples emerging of completely citizen-centric models. For example, a project called Healthful, that instead of the state or the provider assuming that they will need to build a health system, the citizens deciding what information they want to put into a medical record system, who they want to share it with, the basis on which they will provide people with access and when and how they access it. And again, if you extrapolate these models, what impact will they have on the way that the public sector thinks about delivering its policies? There was a lot of talk just before the break about it's the economy stupid or it's the system stupid. I've actually got on up here, it's the internet stupid. A lot of people talk about the web, but the internet to me is actually much more wide than that. It's not just about building portals and websites. It's about the way that the internet will enable us to access information and services anytime, anywhere, in ways that make sense to us. And that also the internet as a grid will change everything. There will be no digital divide in the sense of I can't use a mouse and a keyboard. People will still be able to experience internet-based services being delivered to them in other ways and through other channels. And I thought it was worth looking back to last century, a project I encountered back in the late 1990s, a single change of address service. And here we are, 2008, and people are still talking about a single change of address service with government. Well, it was done 8 or 9 years ago. The technology wasn't the issue. But because it was seen as a technology project, it sort of got a tick in the box. Oh, well, proof of concept, done that, let's move on. What never happened was the cultural and organisational change that needed to accompany that technology. And I think that reinforces the points we heard in the first session. So I think the big change going on at the moment is public sector should be thinking about how it's enabled by what's happening out there, not to just copy what's happening, but to start thinking about the internet in the round and not just websites, but to think about how it can expose interfaces, APIs if you like, that will enable other people to take and repurpose public sector information and services in ways that make sense for them. Good news for government is maybe shorter time to delivery, better reliability, and actually citizens and consumers, once they feel they have more ownership and control of information, tend to interact far more with that information. It becomes more useful to both the provider and the consumer. And if we take the typical example of the mashup that's out there today, why is it so difficult now, even now, to take a lot of public sector information and just dynamically overlay it on maps in the way we want to see it? Why can't we, for example, just look at crime in our local area or the available jobs in our local area? All of that information is sitting there in the public sector, but again, it sort of makes the point, it's still being published in that textual sort of narrative. It isn't really published in a form that enables users to really take it and take advantage of the internet. And there were some lessons learned some time ago. Some of the portals put up a public service channel back in the early part of this century, I guess. And there was huge disappointment because hardly anybody clicked on the button that said public service channel or public sector channel. And there was a lot of anger with the portal providers saying, why is nobody using the service? You're not marketing it. And actually, what people soon realised is people only usually go to public sector services either under duress or distress. So people aren't generally going to click on it on a portal unless they have to. And a far more important model was discovered, which was making that content available in a place that made sense to the citizen. So if it was something about motoring, it could pop up, for example, on maybe the Top Gear pages of the BBC, somewhere where people would be looking and where that information might actually be an additional benefit to you. In terms of where the internet is driving most rapidly into policy areas, I think that's around care and health and the way in which technology and citizen expectations seem to me to be drifting downwards towards data and applications at the edge under citizen control, enabling people, for example, to live longer, better lives in their own homes and communities. And if you start thinking about that, what sort of implications does that example have for the way policymakers think about healthcare provision in the future, whether they build large hospitals or whether, if there's a return to sort of community-based care, actually support needs to be thought about in quite a different way. And that's quite a simple example, but if you extrapolate what's happening across the internet right across all of those functional silos as we see them today, how should we be thinking about changing the very way policy making happens because of what the internet now makes possible? So, brief summary here, conscious of running out of time. This is really about how can the public sector and the private sector make best use of each other's strengths, and how can the public sector use the internet in order to enable services to be provided to people in a place and a manner of their choosing, rather than a provider assuming they know best about how people might want to consume those services. The net result would ideally be both public policy and technology working together, not technology and IT seen as something over there the IT guys do once we've decided what our policy is. And in terms of how rapidly things change, well, as a technology person, I think it happens ridiculously slowly. And in fact, the average time from concept to product out there is about 20 years. If you want to know what's happening about 10 years out in technology, look around what was happening 10 years ago. By the time it hits the mainstream, it's roughly a 20-year cycle. What we often think of as churn are just fairly minor changes to existing models. For things to move from concept to mainstream is actually a slow process. And the underlying message there is always plenty of time to plan for these things in both private and public sector. So I think a problem at the moment is IT is focused on business as usual within existing service models. But the internet will only realise its full potential in the delivery of public services when it's understood to be a policy lever. If we can get that right, then I think the internet will enable policymakers to execute more swiftly upon the decisions they make, and for citizens to feel more engaged and involved in those policies and the way they impact upon them. Just a brief summary, going back to the main points about exposing things as interfaces, not thinking about websites, but thinking about the ubiquitous nature of the internet and the way in which it will enable policy to be changed in the future. Final quote, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And I also think that applies right across the ideas of literacy that we were talking about earlier. That's my very quick take on how the internet will truly change the nature of public services in the UK, but only when we understand IT is not sitting in a silo, as we were talking about earlier.
I think that was an extremely good start, giving you some ideas. By the way, those who, like me, think that these rooms are wasting a huge amount and contribute to climate change by keeping their temperatures above 19.5 degrees centigrade, do take your jackets off. Anyway, I think what we'll do now is go straight on to William Heath, who's got a presentation all fired up and ready to go. And thank you.